No one expected a podcast recording that was meant to showcase Jimin and Jungkook's most honest conversation to end in a silence so devastating. Just as a seemingly innocent question began to uncover a wound buried for years, Jimin suddenly stopped the recording and walked out without looking back. Jungkook froze in place, while the other members exchanged uneasy glances, as if they had just witnessed something that was never meant to be revealed. But what truth was so painful that Jimin chose silence over speaking one more word? Jimin and Jungkook had spent years building a bond that countless people admired but very few truly understood. Behind every shared smile, every effortless laugh, and every unforgettable moment captured on camera was a quiet trust forged through countless challenges, exhausting schedules, and moments when only the two of them truly understood the weight they carried. Their connection had never depended on grand gestures. It lived in the smallest details, a reassuring glance before stepping onto a stage, an encouraging smile after a difficult rehearsal, or the silent comfort of simply sitting beside one another when the world became overwhelming. To everyone watching from the outside, they appeared unbreakable, as though nothing could ever come between them. Yet even the strongest bonds can begin to crack long before anyone notices the first fracture. As their individual responsibilities grew, so did the invisible distance between them. Interviews became more frequent, solo projects demanded more attention, and every public appearance seemed to invite new rumors about their relationship. Jimin handled the pressure with his usual warmth, hiding exhaustion behind gentle smiles that convinced everyone he was doing just fine. Jungkook, meanwhile, buried himself in relentless work, believing that pushing forward was the only way to protect the people he cared about. Neither realized that their shared silence was slowly becoming heavier than any words they could have spoken. The idea for the podcast had seemed perfect from the beginning. RM believed it would give everyone a chance to step away from scripted interviews and speak openly about friendship, growth, and the emotional journey they had experienced together. Jin welcomed the opportunity with his familiar optimism, while Sugar quietly hoped that honest conversations might ease burdens that had been carried for too long. J-Hope filled the preparation with contagious energy, determined to keep the atmosphere light, and Taehyung watched everything with thoughtful eyes, noticing subtle changes that others overlooked. Among them all, only he sensed that Jimin's smiles had become just a little shorter whenever Jungkook entered the room. No one asked why. Perhaps they believed time would heal whatever had changed. Perhaps they feared discovering an answer that could alter everything they had built together. Whatever the reason, the growing silence remained untouched, quietly weaving itself into every rehearsal, every meal, and every shared schedule. On the morning of the recording, the studio felt unusually calm. Soft lights illuminated the microphones, cameras waited silently behind the glass, and every seat had been carefully arranged to create an intimate atmosphere. Everything appeared ordinary, yet an invisible tension lingered in the room like the calm before a storm. Jimin paused for a brief moment before taking his seat, his fingers tightening around a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Across from him, Jungkook offered a small smile that never quite reached his eyes. Neither of them knew that before the day was over, one unexpected question would force a hidden truth to the surface, and the recording would become the moment that changed all of their lives forever. The recording began with an atmosphere that felt warm and familiar. Laughter flowed naturally as each member reflected on cherished memories, unforgettable performances, and the countless moments that had shaped them into a family. The conversation drifted effortlessly from humorous backstage stories to heartfelt reflections about perseverance, making everyone in the studio believe the episode would become one of their most memorable recordings. Even Jimin appeared more relaxed, his gentle smile returning whenever the discussion centered on the early days they had struggled through together. Yet beneath that calm expression, an invisible battle continued to unfold. As the minutes passed, the questions became more personal. The producers had encouraged sincerity rather than polished answers, believing authenticity would resonate with listeners. One by one, the members shared moments of fear, regret, and gratitude that had never been discussed publicly. RM spoke about the burden of leadership, Jin reflected on protecting the younger members, and Sugar quietly admitted that success had never erased the loneliness hidden behind endless work. J-Hope described how hope itself sometimes required incredible strength, while Taehyung reflected on how people often misunderstood silence as indifference when it was sometimes the loudest cry for help. Each confession gradually changed the atmosphere inside the studio. The smiles became softer, the pauses became longer, and every heartbeat seemed louder than the last. Then the conversation gently shifted toward trust, the invisible thread that had held them together through every triumph and every hardship. Without warning, the host asked Jimin to describe the moment when his trust had been tested the most. For a brief second, time seemed to stop. Jimin's breathing grew shallow as memories he had fought desperately to bury resurfaced all at once. His fingers tightened beneath the table until his knuckles turned pale. Across from him, Jungkook lowered his eyes, as though he already knew exactly which memory had returned. No one else noticed the silent exchange except Taehyung, whose expression subtly changed the moment he saw the fear flicker across both of their faces. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Jimin tried to answer, but the words refused to come. His lips parted before closing again, and the microphone captured nothing except the sound of an unsteady breath. Cameras continued rolling while the production staff waited patiently, assuming he simply needed a moment to collect his thoughts. But what they could not see was the storm raging inside him, a storm built from months of unanswered questions, sleepless nights, and one painful misunderstanding that had quietly rewritten everything he believed about the person he trusted most. Jungkook remained completely still. His face revealed almost nothing, yet his eyes carried a weight that no camera could fully capture. They were not the eyes of someone hiding anger. They were the eyes of someone carrying unbearable guilt. Taehyung's heartbeat quickened. He remembered fragments of a night that no one else fully understood, a night filled with hurried phone calls, closed doors, whispered conversations, and a promise that had forced everyone involved into silence. It was a promise meant to protect someone they loved. But the longer that secret remained hidden, the more it poisoned the friendship it had been intended to save. The producers exchanged uncertain glances behind the control room glass. Something was undeniably wrong. No script had prepared them for the heavy silence filling the studio. The atmosphere had transformed from comforting nostalgia into unbearable tension within seconds. Every member could feel it, yet no one dared to interrupt. Then Jimin slowly reached toward the microphone. His trembling hand hovered over the controls for only a moment before pressing the button that instantly ended the recording. The sudden silence echoed louder than any confession ever could. And as Jimin quietly stood and walked toward the exit without looking back, Jungkook remained frozen in his chair, realizing that the secret he had sacrificed everything to protect might finally be moments away from destroying them both forever. The studio door closed with a quiet click, yet the sound echoed through everyone's thoughts like a thunderclap. For several long seconds, no one moved. The recording lights had gone dark, but the emotional tension inside the room only grew heavier. RM instinctively stood, uncertain whether to follow Jimin or give him the space he so clearly needed. Jin lowered his head, his usual optimism replaced by a worried silence. Even J-Hope, who always searched for a way to lift the mood, found himself unable to force a reassuring smile. Jungkook remained seated. His eyes never left the empty chair across from him, as if he still expected Jimin to return and pretend that nothing had happened. But deep inside, he knew that moment had been building for far longer than anyone realized. This was not the result of a single painful question. It was the consequence of countless unanswered moments that had quietly accumulated until silence became impossible to carry. Taehyung slowly exhaled. He had hoped the truth would never have to surface this way. Months earlier, he had watched Jungkook make a decision that no one else fully understood. It had been a choice born not from selfishness, but from desperation. Jungkook had believed that sacrificing Jimin's trust was a smaller price than allowing him to carry an unbearable burden. At the time, it had seemed like the only way to protect someone he loved. Instead, it had slowly destroyed them both. Outside the studio, Jimin walked aimlessly through the quiet hallway, his heartbeat refusing to slow. Every memory he had tried to lock away came rushing back with painful clarity. He remembered the sudden distance, the unanswered messages, the cancelled plans, and the countless nights he had convinced himself that Jungkook had simply stopped caring. The absence of an explanation had hurt far more than any harsh words ever could. It had forced him to create his own answers, and every answer had pointed to betrayal. What Jimin never knew was that every unanswered message had been read. Every missed call had broken Jungkook's heart. Every moment of distance had been a choice that wounded him just as deeply. Leaning against the cold wall, Jimin closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. The hallway was empty, yet it felt as though invisible memories surrounded him from every direction. He questioned whether walking away had been the right decision, but remaining inside that studio had become impossible. One more question, one more memory, and he feared years of carefully hidden emotions would have spilled out before millions of listeners. Back inside, RM quietly approached Jungkook. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The guilt written across Jungkook's face revealed more than any explanation ever could. Sugar watched the scene with growing concern. He had spent years observing the quiet emotions others failed to notice, and now he recognized something frightening. This was no ordinary misunderstanding. Whatever had happened between Jimin and Jungkook had roots stretching far deeper than anyone had imagined. Then Taehyung slowly reached into his bag. His fingers tightened around a worn brown envelope that had remained hidden for months. The edges were creased from being carried everywhere, as though someone had intended to deliver it countless times but never found the courage. Taehyung stared at it for several silent moments. He had promised never to reveal what was inside unless there was absolutely no other choice. Looking toward the hallway where Jimin had disappeared, then back at Jungkook, whose expression had become one of quiet defeat, Taehyung realized the promise he had protected for so long was no longer saving anyone. It was destroying everyone. With trembling hands, he placed the envelope on the table. No one spoke. Because they all sensed that whatever was hidden inside those pages would finally reveal the truth behind the silence, and once it was opened, Jimin and Jungkook's lives would never be the same again. No one reached for the envelope. It rested in the center of the table like a weight that none of them were prepared to carry. The silence surrounding it felt almost sacred, as though opening it would erase the last fragile barrier protecting years of hidden pain. Every pair of eyes drifted toward Jungkook, but he remained motionless, his breathing uneven, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion rather than fear. Taehyung finally broke the stillness, not with words, but with a slow step backward. His expression revealed the burden he had carried for months. He had watched two people who cared deeply for each other slowly become strangers, all because of a promise that had once seemed necessary. At the time, keeping the truth hidden had appeared to be an act of loyalty. Now it looked like the greatest mistake any of them had ever made. RM carefully picked up the envelope. The paper was worn from being folded and unfolded countless times. It was obvious that someone had intended to deliver it over and over again, only to lose the courage each time. On the front, written in familiar handwriting, were only a few simple words. For Jimin. When the time is finally right. The room fell into an even deeper silence. Jin quietly closed his eyes, while Sugar lowered his head, already sensing that whatever lay inside would explain far more than anyone wanted to hear. J-Hope's hands tightened together as he struggled to control the growing anxiety filling the room. Jungkook finally looked up. For the first time that day, the composure he had fought so hard to maintain completely disappeared. Regret flooded his expression. Not because the truth was about to be revealed, but because it had taken so long. Across the hallway, Jimin stood alone beside a window overlooking the city. Rain had begun to fall, scattering tiny droplets across the glass until the lights outside blurred into soft streaks. He watched them without really seeing them, lost inside memories that refused to leave him. He remembered the day everything had changed. Jungkook had suddenly become distant without explanation. Messages that once received immediate replies were answered hours later, or not at all. Late-night conversations quietly disappeared. Promises to spend time together were cancelled again and again. Every attempt Jimin made to understand was met with gentle avoidance rather than honesty. Little by little, his confidence gave way to doubt. Doubt slowly became disappointment. And disappointment eventually hardened into heartbreak. The most painful part had never been the distance itself. It was believing that he no longer mattered enough to deserve an explanation. Back inside the studio, RM unfolded the first page with careful hands. Before anyone could begin reading, Taehyung quietly placed another item beside the letter. A small digital voice recorder. Unlike the envelope, this device had never been seen before. Its battery indicator still glowed. It had never been erased. Taehyung stared at it for a long moment before slowly closing his eyes. Everyone understood immediately. The letter told only part of the story. The recording contained the rest. Jungkook lowered his head, unable to stop his hands from trembling. For months he had protected those two pieces of evidence because he believed revealing them would only bring Jimin greater pain. Now he realized that hiding them had caused something even worse. It had allowed the person he wanted to protect to spend every single day believing a lie. RM looked toward the others, silently asking the question none of them wanted to answer. Should they call Jimin back? Or should the truth finally speak for itself? As his thumb slowly moved toward the play button on the recorder, every heartbeat in the room seemed to stop, because whatever voice emerged from that device would forever change the story Jimin had believed, and determine whether there was still anything left to save. RM hesitated for only a moment before pressing the play button. A soft burst of static filled the room, followed by several seconds of silence. Everyone instinctively leaned forward, as if the recording itself carried the answer to months of unanswered questions. Then a familiar voice emerged. It was Jungkook's. The recording had clearly been made late at night. His breathing was uneven, and every word sounded as though it had been weighed down by exhaustion. There was no performance, no carefully chosen phrases, no attempt to appear strong. It was simply the voice of someone carrying a burden too heavy to share. The message was never meant for the public. It had never even been meant for the other members. It was a private confession intended only for Jimin. As the recording continued, the room grew impossibly still. Jungkook spoke about making a choice that he knew Jimin would misunderstand. He admitted that creating distance had felt like betraying the person he trusted most, but he believed there was no other path. Every day he stayed away felt like another piece of himself breaking apart, yet he convinced himself that temporary pain was better than exposing Jimin to a truth that could leave permanent scars. No one interrupted. Not because they already knew the story, but because they didn't. Even RM, Jin, Sugar, and J-Hope slowly realized there were pieces of the puzzle they had never been told. Taehyung lowered his eyes. He had heard the recording once before. That single night had been enough to convince him why Jungkook had begged him never to let Jimin hear it, not until everything was over. But everything had never truly ended. Instead, it had silently followed them into every rehearsal, every performance, every shared celebration, and every lonely moment when two people stood only a few steps apart while feeling worlds away. Then the recording reached the sentence that changed the atmosphere completely. Jungkook confessed that the distance between them had never been caused by fading affection, resentment, or betrayal. It had begun the night he received devastating news about someone close to the group, a crisis so serious that it demanded complete confidentiality until it was resolved. In trying to protect that person's privacy and shield Jimin from becoming involved in an impossible situation, Jungkook accepted every misunderstanding that followed. He believed that once the crisis had passed, he would finally explain everything. But the right moment never came. Each day of silence made the truth harder to tell. Every missed opportunity made confession feel impossible. Until silence itself became the prison neither of them knew how to escape. A deep sense of regret settled over everyone in the room. The sacrifice Jungkook had made had come from love. The footsteps grew louder with every passing second. No one inside the studio dared to move. The atmosphere had changed completely. What had begun as an ordinary podcast recording had become something far more personal, a moment that no camera, no microphone, and no audience had ever been meant to witness. Even though the recording had already been stopped, it felt as though time itself had continued documenting every heartbeat inside the room. The studio door slowly opened. Jimin stepped inside. His eyes were still red, but the storm that had driven him out moments earlier had quieted into something else: confusion. He immediately sensed that something had changed. No one was standing where they had been before. The envelope now rested open on the table, and beside it lay the silent voice recorder. His gaze settled on Jungkook. For the first time in months, neither of them looked away. The distance between them was only a few steps, yet it carried the weight of countless unanswered nights, abandoned conversations, and emotions neither of them had been brave enough to confront. Jimin searched Jungkook's face, looking for the certainty he had once known so well. Instead, he found exhaustion, and a grief that looked far older than the misunderstanding itself. RM gently slid the voice recorder across the table. He didn't need to explain. Jimin understood that whatever was inside that small device had changed everyone else's expressions. With trembling hands, he picked it up. The room fell into absolute silence as he pressed play. Jungkook's voice filled the studio once again. This time, every word landed directly in Jimin's heart. The loneliness. The guilt. The impossible decision. The desperate hope that one day everything could be explained. As the recording continued, Jimin's expression slowly changed. The anger he had carried for so long began to dissolve, replaced by disbelief. Memories he had interpreted as rejection suddenly looked different. Every unanswered message, every cancelled plan, every quiet goodbye no longer seemed like proof that Jungkook had stopped caring. They looked like the actions of someone fighting a battle alone. By the time the recording reached its final confession, tears were already streaming silently down Jimin's face. He lowered the recorder before the last words had fully faded. No one spoke. There was nothing anyone else could add. For months, Jimin had believed he had been abandoned. For months, Jungkook had believed enduring that misunderstanding was the only way to protect someone he loved. Both had suffered. Both had been wrong. And both had paid a heartbreaking price for a silence neither of them had created with selfish intentions. Jungkook slowly stood from his chair. His movements were hesitant, almost uncertain, as though he no longer believed he had the right to stand before Jimin. His shoulders carried the weight of every decision he wished he could undo. There was no expectation of immediate forgiveness, only a quiet acceptance that the truth had finally come too late. Jimin looked at him for what felt like an eternity. he realized that the greatest wound had never been betrayal. It had been the absence of trust in a moment when both of them had needed each other most. The room remained frozen as the two stood facing one another, separated not by anger anymore, but by the painful realization that love alone is not always enough to protect a relationship. Without honesty, even the purest intentions can become the source of unbearable heartbreak. Outside, the rain finally began to ease. A faint ray of sunlight slipped through the studio window, illuminating the table where the unfinished podcast notes still lay scattered. The recording that had been meant to entertain listeners had instead uncovered a truth capable of changing every life inside that room. But one question still remained unanswered. Now that the truth had finally been revealed, could broken trust truly be rebuilt? Or had the silence already taken away the future Jimin and Jungkook once believed they would always share? Neither Jimin nor Jungkook moved. The silence between them no longer felt hostile. It felt fragile, as though one careless moment could either mend everything or shatter what little remained. Every member watched quietly, understanding that this was no longer something anyone else could fix. Some wounds could only be healed by the two people who had lived through them. Jimin lowered his eyes to the recorder still resting in his hands. For months, he had searched for someone to blame. He had blamed unanswered messages. He had blamed empty promises. Most of all, he had blamed Jungkook. Now, standing only a few feet away from the person he had believed had abandoned him, he realized that pain had distorted every memory. The silence he had interpreted as rejection had, in reality, been a desperate attempt to protect someone else. It had never erased the hurt, but it transformed its meaning completely. At the same time, Jungkook carried a different burden. He understood that good intentions could never erase the consequences of his choices. Keeping the truth hidden had protected a secret. It had also broken the trust of the person whose trust mattered most. He finally accepted something he had refused to face for months. Love without honesty could become another form of loneliness. RM quietly looked around the room. The podcast microphones were still arranged exactly as they had been before everything changed. Empty chairs surrounded the table, waiting for a conversation that had never reached its ending. The recording lights remained dark, but somehow the room felt brighter than it had all day. Tae-hyung stepped forward and carefully gathered the scattered pages from the table. The envelope, the letter, and the recorder no longer felt like evidence. They had become reminders. Reminders that even silence could leave scars deeper than harsh words. Jin let out a slow breath, relief softening the tension in his face. Sugar closed his notebook without writing another word. J-Hope looked through the studio window at the rain finally coming to an end. It was as though the entire day had been waiting for this single moment. Jimin slowly raised his head. For the first time in a long while, he looked directly into Jungkook's eyes without anger clouding his thoughts. What he saw there was not betrayal. It was exhaustion, regret, and a loneliness that mirrored his own. In that instant, Jimin understood that they had spent months mourning the same friendship from opposite sides of the same misunderstanding. Neither had truly walked away. Neither had truly stopped caring. They had simply become prisoners of a silence that neither knew how to break. A quiet sense of peace began to settle over the room. Not because every wound had healed. Not because every painful memory had disappeared. But because the truth had finally found its way into the open. The podcast recording would never be released. Its unfinished episode would remain locked away, known only to the people who had lived through it. Yet everyone present understood that the recording had accomplished something far more meaningful than any successful broadcast ever could. It had forced hidden pain into the light. It had reminded them that trust is not protected by keeping difficult truths hidden. It is protected by facing those truths together, no matter how frightening they may be. Long after they left the studio, the memory of that unfinished podcast remained with them. Not as the day everything fell apart, but as the day they finally learned that the strongest relationships are not those that never face misunderstanding. They are the ones brave enough to choose honesty before silence, forgiveness before pride, and understanding before assumption. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Sometimes, the words left unspoken are far more dangerous than the truths we fear to say. Weeks passed, but the memory of that unfinished podcast never truly disappeared. Life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Rehearsals resumed, schedules filled every hour of the day, and public appearances continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Cameras once again captured smiles, laughter, and carefully composed moments that reassured millions of fans everything was normal. But those who had been inside the studio that day knew better. Something fundamental had changed. Not because the pain had vanished overnight, but because silence no longer ruled their hearts. Jimin and Jungkook didn't immediately return to the closeness they once shared. Trust, once broken by misunderstanding, could not be rebuilt through a single revelation. It demanded patience, consistency, and countless small moments that proved the truth was stronger than the fear that had once separated them. Instead of forcing everything back to the way it had been, they allowed themselves to begin again. One quiet step at a time. There were no dramatic announcements. No public explanations. No attempts to erase the past. Only small changes that almost no one else noticed. Jungkook no longer allowed difficult thoughts to remain locked inside him. Whenever the pressure became unbearable, he chose honesty instead of isolation. Jimin, in turn, stopped assuming that silence always meant rejection. He learned that asking difficult questions required far more courage than quietly accepting painful conclusions. Their conversations gradually became longer. The pauses between them became lighter. The awkwardness that had once filled every shared room slowly faded, replaced by a quiet understanding that neither expected perfection anymore. RM watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction. Leadership had taught him that the strongest teams were never those without conflict. They were the ones willing to confront it before resentment had the chance to grow. Jin often smiled whenever he caught Jimin and Jungkook laughing together over something insignificant. Sugar noticed that the tension which had once lingered in every rehearsal had finally disappeared. J-Hope's endless optimism returned naturally. Taehyung, more than anyone else, understood what those small moments truly meant. He no longer carried the envelope. He no longer carried the recorder. The burden he had protected for so long had finally been laid to rest. Months later, the studio where everything had happened was prepared for another podcast recording. The same microphones. The same chairs. The same, only this time, the atmosphere felt entirely different. Before anyone pressed the record button, Jimin quietly looked around the room. His eyes rested briefly on the empty corner where he had once stood, overwhelmed by emotions he believed he could never escape. He realized that healing rarely comes from forgetting. It comes from remembering without allowing the pain to control the future. Across the table, Jungkook noticed the faint smile on Jimin's face. It wasn't the carefree smile of years ago. It was something stronger. A smile shaped by forgiveness. A smile earned through truth. When the recording finally began, no one tried to avoid difficult subjects anymore. They spoke honestly about fear. About pressure. About how easy it is to misunderstand someone when silence replaces communication. No personal secrets were revealed. No painful memories were exploited. Yet every word carried the wisdom born from experiences that had forever changed them. The episode became one of the most meaningful conversations they had ever shared, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And although millions of listeners would never know about the unfinished recording that came before it, its invisible legacy echoed through every honest sentence spoken that day. Some stories end with dramatic reunions. Others end with unforgettable sacrifices. This story ended with something quieter, but perhaps even more powerful. The understanding that trust is rebuilt not in extraordinary moments, but in ordinary days when people continue choosing honesty, compassion, and each other. Because in the end, the podcast that Jimin once stopped unexpectedly did not become a symbol of heartbreak. It became the beginning of a future where silence no longer had the power to change everything.